What if one of the most powerful forces shaping modern spirituality, psychology, art, and even science was never meant to be taught openly, but instead passed quietly from master to student, hidden in symbols, rituals, and coded texts for thousands of years? Long before self-help movements, mindfulness apps, or modern spiritual language entered American culture, a shadow tradition existed in the West, one that claimed human beings were capable of awakening hidden knowledge buried deep within the soul, knowledge that could transform the individual and, by extension, the world itself. This tradition is known today as Western Esotericism, and its story is far stranger, deeper, and more influential than most people realize. Western esotericism is not a single religion or belief system, but a loose family of ideas, practices, and philosophies that stretch back to the ancient Mediterranean world and quietly weave through the foundations of Western civilization. At its heart lies a radical idea that challenged mainstream religious authority for centuries, that truth is not only revealed from above through institutions, but discovered from within through direct experience, inner transformation, and symbolic understanding. In ancient times, this idea was both sacred and dangerous. Those who claimed access to hidden wisdom often walked a fine line between reverence and persecution. Yet despite suppression, misunderstanding, and ridicule, esoteric thought survived, evolving in secrecy, resurfacing during moments of cultural crisis, and subtly influencing how the modern West understands the self, the cosmos, and the meaning of knowledge itself. To understand why Western esotericism is so often misunderstood today, we must first recognize how deeply it has been mischaracterized. In popular culture, it is frequently dismissed as superstition, occult fantasy, or fringe mysticism, lumped together with conspiracy theories or sensationalized imagery of secret societies and forbidden rituals. This dismissal obscures a far more complex reality. Historically, many of the greatest thinkers of their time, philosophers, scientists, artists, and theologians, engaged seriously with esoteric ideas. They did not see esotericism as opposed to reason, but as a deeper layer of understanding that complemented logic, mathematics, and observation. The problem, however, was that esoteric knowledge was never meant for everyone, at least not all at once. It was traditionally reserved for those who demonstrated moral discipline, intellectual rigor, and spiritual readiness. This selective transmission created an aura of secrecy that later generations would interpret as elitism or deception rather than protection of ideas considered powerful or easily misunderstood. The roots of Western esotericism can be traced back to the ancient world, particularly to the crossroads of Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern civilizations. In ancient Greece, mystery traditions, such as the Eleusinian mysteries, promised initiates a profound transformation through symbolic ritual rather than public doctrine. Participants were sworn to secrecy, not because the rituals were sinister, but because words alone were believed to be inadequate for expressing what was experienced. Knowledge, in this worldview, was not merely information, but initiation, something that reshaped perception itself. Around the same time, philosophical movements like Platonism proposed that reality had multiple levels, a visible world of appearances and an invisible world of eternal forms. This idea would become a cornerstone of esoteric thought, that the material world is a reflection of deeper, hidden realities, and that the human soul can ascend toward them through disciplined insight. In ancient Egypt, a parallel tradition emerged around the figure later known as Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. Texts attributed to Hermes taught that humanity contains a divine spark, and that true knowledge, or gnosis, comes from awakening this inner light.
These writings would later become foundational to Hermeticism, one of the most influential currents in Western esotericism. Hermetic ideas traveled across cultures and centuries, preserved by scholars, mystics, and translators who recognized their philosophical depth even as political and religious authorities grew suspicious of their implications.
As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, esoteric ideas did not disappear, but were transformed, and in many cases, pushed underground. Early Christian thinkers debated fiercely over the nature of salvation, knowledge, and spiritual authority. Some groups, later labeled Gnostics, argued that salvation came through secret knowledge of divine origins rather than obedience to institutional doctrine. This posed a direct challenge to emerging church hierarchies, which emphasized uniform belief and public creed. As a result, many esoteric interpretations of Christian thought were condemned as heretical, their texts destroyed or hidden. Yet suppression did not erase these ideas. Instead, it forced them into coded language, symbolic art, and allegorical interpretation. Medieval scholars, monks, and mystics continued to explore hidden meanings within Scripture, convinced that sacred texts contained multiple layers accessible only through contemplation and inner purification. Alchemy emerged during this period, not merely as an attempt to turn lead into gold, but as a symbolic system describing the transformation of the human soul. To the uninitiated, alchemical texts appeared absurd or fraudulent. To insiders, they described a profound psychological and spiritual journey using the language of metals, fire, and transmutation. This dual meaning was intentional. It allowed esoteric knowledge to survive in plain sight while remaining protected from literal interpretation. By the time of the Renaissance, Western esotericism experienced a dramatic revival. The rediscovery of ancient Greek and Hermetic texts ignited a belief that humanity was reclaiming a lost wisdom from a golden age. Renaissance thinkers argued that ancient philosophy, Christian theology, magic, and science were not separate domains, but interconnected paths toward truth. Figures like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola believed that the universe was a living, meaningful whole, structured by correspondences between the macrocosm of the cosmos and the microcosm of the human being. This idea suggested that by understanding symbols, numbers, and harmonies, one could participate consciously in the order of creation. Such ideas influenced art, architecture, music, and early scientific inquiry. Even figures who would later be remembered as champions of rational science were deeply engaged with esoteric traditions. The boundary between science and mysticism, so clear in modern thinking, simply did not exist in the same way for them. However, as modern institutions of religion and science consolidated power, esotericism once again became suspect. Its emphasis on personal revelation threatened religious authority, while its symbolic language conflicted with the emerging demand for empirical proof. Over time, esoteric traditions were marginalized, ridiculed, or relegated to secret societies and fringe movements. Yet they never vanished. Instead, they adapted, influencing psychology, literature, political symbolism, and contemporary spirituality in ways that are still unfolding today. The true challenge in understanding Western esotericism lies not in uncovering secret rituals or hidden organizations, but in recognizing how deeply its worldview contrasts with modern assumptions about knowledge. It asks uncomfortable questions. Is truth only what can be measured? Is meaning purely subjective? Can inner experience be a legitimate source of knowledge? These questions remain unresolved, and perhaps that is why esotericism continues to provoke fascination and discomfort in equal measure.
As we move deeper into this hidden history, we will see that Western esotericism is not a relic of a superstitious past, but a persistent undercurrent that has shaped how the West understands mystery, transformation, and the possibility that reality is far richer than it appears on the surface. And as this story unfolds, it becomes clear that what was once hidden was not necessarily meant to stay that way forever, but to be rediscovered when humanity was ready to ask deeper questions about itself and the world it inhabits.
As the foundations of Western esotericism took shape across antiquity and the medieval world, a growing tension began to define its fate. A tension between inner knowledge and outer authority, between personal transformation and institutional control. And it is this tension that explains why esotericism has so often been misunderstood, dismissed, or deliberately obscured. To emerging religious and political powers, esoteric traditions posed a subtle but serious threat, not because they encouraged chaos, but because they suggested that ultimate truth could be accessed without mediation. In societies built upon hierarchy, this idea was profoundly unsettling. If individuals could encounter the divine, understand cosmic order, or transform their consciousness directly, what role remained for priests, kings, or dogma? Over time, this fear hardened into suspicion. Esoteric teachings were increasingly framed as dangerous, deceptive, or immoral, even when their practitioners emphasized ethical discipline, intellectual rigor, and spiritual responsibility. By late antiquity, especially as Christianity became institutionalized within the Roman Empire, the boundaries of acceptable belief narrowed. Teachings that emphasized secret knowledge, symbolic interpretation, or inner illumination were labeled heretical, not necessarily because they were incoherent, but because they undermined the Church's authority to define truth publicly and uniformly. This process of exclusion shaped the historical record itself. Texts associated with Gnostic Christianity, Hermetic philosophy, and alternative cosmologies were destroyed, buried, or forgotten, while only fragments survived by chance or through the efforts of scholars working at the margins. What modern audiences often mistake as the disappearance of esotericism was, in reality, its strategic retreat. Rather than vanishing, it learned to hide in metaphor, ritual symbolism, art, and coded language, developing a dual existence that allowed it to survive persecution while remaining accessible to those trained to see beneath the surface. This secrecy, however, carried a long-term cost. Later generations, encountering only fragments or distorted portrayals, came to associate esotericism with irrationality or occult obsession, severing it from its philosophical and ethical foundations. During the Middle Ages, this misunderstanding deepened. Popular imagination reduced complex symbolic systems like alchemy and astrology to crude superstition, ignoring the fact that medieval thinkers understood these disciplines as languages for exploring the relationship between matter, mind, and spirit. Alchemy, for example, was never solely about producing gold. Its texts consistently describe an inner transformation parallel to material processes, a refinement of consciousness symbolized by purification, dissolution, and recombination. Yet because these writings deliberately obscured their meaning to protect against misuse, they appeared nonsensical to outsiders. This pattern repeated across centuries. Esoteric knowledge survived precisely because it was misunderstood, and it was misunderstood precisely because it survived in disguise. As Europe moved toward the early modern period, the problem intensified. The rise of centralized religious authority on one hand, and the emerging dominance of empirical science on the other, squeezed esotericism from both sides. Religious institutions condemned it as unorthodox, while scientific thinkers increasingly dismissed it as untestable or unproductive. This created a false dichotomy that still shapes modern assumptions, the idea that one must choose between rational inquiry and symbolic spiritual insight.
Historically, this divide did not exist. Many pioneers of modern science, including figures later celebrated for their rational achievements, engaged deeply with esoteric traditions, convinced that nature itself was encoded with meaning, waiting to be deciphered. Over time, however, the language of symbols lost legitimacy in public discourse, replaced by a demand for clarity, measurement, and external verification. Esotericism retreated further into secret societies, private manuscripts, and initiatory traditions, reinforcing its reputation as elitist or conspiratorial. Yet this marginalization obscures a critical truth. Western esotericism was never primarily about secrecy for its own sake. It was about the belief that knowledge changes the knower, and therefore must be approached responsibly. This belief clashes sharply with the modern idea that information is neutral and universally accessible. In the esoteric worldview, symbols are not puzzles to be solved, but mirrors reflecting the inner state of the observer. Misunderstanding them is not merely an intellectual error, but a spiritual risk. This perspective explains why esoteric traditions emphasized preparation, ethical grounding, and gradual insight rather than mass dissemination. When viewed through this lens, the historical suppression of esotericism appears less like a rejection of nonsense and more like a conflict between two fundamentally different models of truth. One seeks external authority and standardized belief. The other seeks inner transformation and symbolic understanding. As we move forward in this hidden history, we will see how this conflict shaped the evolution of Western thought, driving esoteric ideas underground while simultaneously ensuring their survival, influence, and eventual re-emergence in unexpected forms. And it is within this tension, between what is seen and what is hidden, that the true story of Western esotericism begins to unfold in earnest.
As Western esotericism moved deeper into the shadows of official history, its ancient roots continued to nourish it from below, drawing strength from civilizations far older than medieval Europe or Christian doctrine, reaching back to the symbolic worlds of Egypt, Greece, and the Near East. To understand this hidden lineage, one must step into a time when philosophy, religion, science, and myth were not separate categories, but different languages describing the same reality. In ancient Egypt, knowledge was never merely intellectual. It was sacred, transformative, and inseparable from the structure of the cosmos itself. The Egyptians believed the universe was governed by Ma'at, a principle of cosmic order, balance, and truth, and that human beings could align themselves with this order through ritual, ethical living, and symbolic understanding. Priests and scribes guarded this knowledge carefully, encoding it in hieroglyphs, temple architecture, and mythic narratives designed to operate on multiple levels at once. This tradition profoundly influenced later esoteric thought, especially through the figure of Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and hidden knowledge, who would later re-emerge in the Hellenistic world as Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes was not viewed simply as a mythological character, but as a symbolic embodiment of divine intellect communicating directly with humanity. Texts attributed to him taught that the human soul contains a spark of the divine, and that awakening this inner light was the true purpose of knowledge. These Hermetic writings described the cosmos as a living, intelligent system in which mind and matter were intimately connected, a vision radically different from the mechanical universe that would later dominate modern thinking. When Greek philosophers encountered Egyptian and Near Eastern wisdom, a powerful synthesis emerged. Plato, whose influence on Western thought cannot be overstated, absorbed and transformed these ideas into a philosophical framework that would shape esotericism for centuries. His theory of forms proposed that the visible world is a shadow of a higher, invisible reality, and that the soul, through discipline and insight, can ascend toward truth. This was not abstract speculation alone, it was a spiritual roadmap. For Plato and his followers, philosophy was a way of life, a process of inner purification and remembrance, rather than a purely academic exercise.
Later Platonic traditions, especially Neoplatonism, developed this vision further, describing a universe that emanates from a single source of divine intelligence and returns to it through stages of consciousness. These ideas resonated deeply with Hermetic thought, reinforcing the esoteric conviction that the universe is structured, meaningful, and accessible through symbolic understanding. Alongside philosophy, the ancient mystery traditions played a crucial role in shaping Western esotericism. The Eleusinian mysteries, among the most famous, promised initiates a profound transformation through ritual experience rather than doctrinal teaching. Participants believed they encountered a truth about life, death, and rebirth that could not be communicated through words alone. This emphasis on direct, initiatory knowledge would become a defining feature of esoteric traditions, distinguishing them from religions based primarily on public belief. Importantly, these mysteries were not fringe practices. They were integrated into mainstream ancient society, attended by respected citizens, statesmen, and philosophers. Their secrecy was not a sign of deception, but a recognition that certain experiences lose their power when reduced to explanation. As the Roman world expanded, these diverse traditions intermingled, creating a rich esoteric underground that persisted even as political and religious landscapes shifted. When Christianity emerged, it did not arise in isolation, but within this complex environment of philosophical and mystical experimentation. Early Christian thinkers borrowed heavily from Platonic and Hermetic concepts, particularly the idea of divine light, inner transformation, and the soul's ascent toward God. However, as Christianity moved from persecuted sect to state religion, the balance shifted. What had once been tolerated diversity hardened into orthodoxy, and esoteric interpretations were increasingly viewed as threats to unity. Teachings that emphasized secret knowledge or symbolic readings of Scripture were condemned, not because they lacked intellectual sophistication, but because they challenged the authority of a centralized institution. Many texts were destroyed, while others survived only in fragments or translations preserved by Islamic scholars during Europe's intellectual Dark Ages. This loss reshaped Western memory. By severing esotericism from its ancient philosophical roots, later generations came to see it as marginal or irrational rather than foundational. Yet the current never truly dried up. Through translation movements, mystical theology, and symbolic art, ancient esoteric ideas continued to flow beneath the surface of Western culture. Medieval mystics described visions and inner transformations that echoed Neoplatonic ascent. Jewish Kabbalah developed a complex symbolic map of divine emanation and human participation in cosmic repair. Islamic philosophers preserved and expanded Hermetic and Platonic texts, reintroducing them to Europe centuries later. Each of these traditions contributed threads to a shared tapestry of esoteric thought, united by the belief that reality is layered, symbolic, and participatory. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, these ancient roots would burst back into visibility with extraordinary force, challenging established boundaries between science, religion, and philosophy. But even before that revival, the foundations had already been laid by civilizations long gone, whose understanding of knowledge as sacred transformation rather than mere information would continue to shape Western esotericism in ways both hidden and profound. And it is this ancient inheritance, quietly passed across cultures and centuries, that reveals Western esotericism not as an anomaly, but as one of the deepest and most persistent undercurrents in the history of Western thought.
As Europe entered the medieval period, Western esotericism did not disappear under the weight of religious authority and social upheaval, but instead adapted, reshaped itself, and learned to survive within a world dominated by the church, feudal power, and strict theological boundaries. In monasteries, scriptoria, and remote centers of learning, esoteric knowledge continued quietly, often disguised as theology, natural philosophy, or devotional practice. Medieval scholars lived in a universe saturated with meaning,
where every object, number, and natural phenomenon was believed to reflect a deeper spiritual reality. This symbolic worldview allowed esoteric ideas to persist under acceptable religious language. Mystics such as Hildegard of Bingen described complex visions of cosmic harmony, divine light, and the interconnectedness of all creation, experiences that echoed ancient Neoplatonic and Hermetic themes even as they were framed within Christian devotion. Meanwhile, alchemy flourished as one of the most misunderstood yet influential esoteric disciplines of the Middle Ages. To modernize, medieval alchemists appear obsessed with primitive chemistry or foolish attempts to create gold, but historical texts reveal a far richer purpose. Alchemy functioned as a symbolic system describing the transformation of both matter and consciousness. The philosopher's stone was not merely a substance, but a metaphor for spiritual perfection, the refinement of the soul through suffering, insight, and disciplined practice. Alchemical manuscripts were intentionally cryptic, filled with strange imagery of kings and queens, serpents, suns and moons, precisely because the process they described was inward and experiential, not mechanical. Only those prepared through study and ethical development were believed capable of understanding them. During this same period, Jewish mysticism crystallized into what would later be known as Kabbalah, offering one of the most intricate esoteric systems in Western history. Kabbalistic teachings described reality as a series of divine emanations flowing from an infinite source, with humanity playing an active role in restoring cosmic balance through intention, ethical action, and symbolic ritual. These ideas would later influence Christian esotericism during the Renaissance, demonstrating how esoteric knowledge crossed religious boundaries even when official doctrines remained divided. Astrology also occupied a respected position in medieval thought, far removed from its modern reputation as entertainment. Medieval astrologers believed celestial movements reflected divine order, and that understanding these patterns allowed humanity to align more harmoniously with cosmic rhythms. Kings consulted astrologers, physicians used astrological timing in treatments, and scholars studied planetary correspondences as part of a unified vision of nature. This worldview assumed the universe was alive, meaningful, and responsive to human consciousness, a foundational esoteric assumption that would later clash with emerging mechanistic science. The Renaissance marked a dramatic turning point as Europe rediscovered ancient texts preserved by Islamic scholars and began to reinterpret humanity's place in the cosmos. This period did not see esotericism merely survive, but openly celebrate it, at least briefly. Renaissance thinkers believed they were reclaiming a lost wisdom from antiquity, a prisca theologia, or ancient theology that united philosophy, magic, religion, and science into a single pursuit of truth. Figures like Marsilio Ficino translated Hermetic and Platonic texts, arguing that the universe was a living organism animated by divine intelligence, and that humans, positioned between matter and spirit, possessed the unique ability to consciously participate in this order. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola famously declared that humanity's dignity lay in its freedom to shape itself, an idea deeply aligned with esoteric teachings about self-transformation. Renaissance magic, far from being crude superstition, was understood as the art of working with hidden sympathies and correspondences within nature. Practitioners believed that symbols, sounds, images, and rituals could influence reality because everything was interconnected through an invisible web of meaning. Art, architecture, and music reflected this belief, embedding geometric proportions, symbolic imagery, and harmonic ratios designed to mirror cosmic order. Even early scientific inquiry emerged from this context. Figures who laid the groundwork for modern science did so within an esoteric framework, convinced that studying nature was a way of reading the mind of God. Yet this renaissance of esotericism was fragile. As religious conflicts intensified
and scientific methodology shifted toward strict empiricism, tolerance for symbolic and mystical interpretations diminished. What had once been celebrated as ancient wisdom became increasingly suspect, accused of heresy on one side and irrationality on the other. Esoteric traditions once again retreated into secrecy, secret societies, coded texts, and private transmission. But the medieval and Renaissance periods left an indelible mark. They proved that Western esotericism was not a marginal curiosity, but a central force shaping philosophy, art, science, and spirituality at moments when the West reconsidered its deepest assumptions about reality and the human role within it. And it is from this fertile, dangerous, and luminous period that the modern echoes of esotericism would later emerge, influencing revolutions in thought that still define the contemporary world.
As the modern world began to take shape, Western esotericism found new ways to survive and exert influence through secret societies, symbolic systems, and hidden power structures that operated behind the visible stage of politics, religion, and culture. When public tolerance for mystical and symbolic knowledge declined, especially after the religious wars of Europe and the rise of centralized nation-states, esoteric traditions did not vanish. They reorganized. Knowledge that was once shared openly among philosophers and scholars was now transmitted through initiation, oath, and layered symbolism, giving rise to groups whose names would later ignite both fascination and fear. Organizations such as the Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and various Hermetic orders claimed lineage from ancient wisdom traditions, presenting themselves not as rebels against society, but as guardians of moral, intellectual, and spiritual refinement. Their secrecy was often practical rather than sinister. In a world where deviation from religious orthodoxy could lead to imprisonment or death, discretion was a matter of survival. Symbols became their primary language. Geometric forms, architectural layouts, ritual gestures, and allegorical narratives conveyed complex philosophical ideas without exposing them to hostile scrutiny. The square and compass, the all-seeing eye, the ladder, the light emerging from darkness, these were not arbitrary emblems, but visual shorthand for ideas about self-mastery, enlightenment, and humanity's place within a structured cosmos. Over time, these symbols migrated beyond lodges and manuscripts into public architecture, civic monuments, and national iconography, quietly shaping the visual language of power itself. This migration has fueled modern suspicions, leading many to assume that secret societies control governments or manipulate history from the shadows. While there is little credible evidence for such grand conspiracies, it is historically accurate to say that esoteric symbolism influenced how power was imagined and expressed. Enlightenment-era thinkers who helped design political systems, educational institutions, and cultural norms often belonged to organizations that valued esoteric ideas about reason, virtue, and moral progress. These groups believed that society could be improved through the cultivation of enlightened individuals, an idea rooted deeply in esoteric traditions of inner transformation preceding outer change. Yet this belief also created tension. When knowledge is framed as initiatory and hierarchical, it risks reinforcing exclusivity, even when its stated goal is universal improvement. Critics then and now argue that such structures mirror the very power imbalances they claim to transcend. This ambiguity is central to understanding esotericism's relationship with power. On one hand, esoteric traditions challenged authority by asserting personal access to truth. On the other, they often reproduced elite networks that controlled education, influence, and symbolic capital. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, as industrialization, colonial expansion, and scientific materialism reshaped the West, esoteric societies adapted again.
Some aligned themselves with nationalist movements, others with utopian visions of social reform, and still others retreated into purely spiritual pursuits. Occult revivals flourished, blending ancient symbols with modern anxieties about meaning, progress, and alienation. The language of initiation, hidden masters, and secret wisdom became increasingly romanticized, sometimes stripped of its ethical and philosophical grounding. This shift contributed to the modern caricature of esotericism as either manipulative elitism or fantastical escapism. Yet beneath these distortions, the core dynamic remained unchanged. Symbols continued to function as tools for shaping perception, identity, and authority. Power was no longer exercised solely through force or law, but through meaning, narrative, and shared imagination. Esoteric traditions understood this long before modern psychology or media theory articulated it. They recognized that symbols organize how people see the world and their place within it. By embedding symbols into rituals, architecture, and cultural myths, they influenced not only individual consciousness, but collective structures of power. This is why esotericism cannot be reduced to secret meetings or hidden handshakes. Its true influence lies in how it taught the West to think symbolically about authority, progress, and human potential. As we approach the modern era, this symbolic legacy will resurface in unexpected ways, shaping new movements, psychological theories, and spiritual revivals that no longer require secrecy, yet still echo the ancient belief that beneath the surface of ordinary reality lies a deeper order waiting to be recognized. And it is in this transition, from hidden lodges to public consciousness, that the next chapter of Western esotericism begins to reveal its most surprising impact.
As the 20th century unfolded and the modern world accelerated into an age of technology, mass communication, and scientific dominance, Western esotericism reached its most unexpected and revealing moment, not by emerging openly as an ancient doctrine, but by quietly reshaping how modern society understands the human mind, identity, creativity, and meaning itself. This is the true climax of the esoteric story, the point where hidden currents surface not as secret rituals, but as foundational influences embedded within psychology, art, politics, and contemporary spirituality. One of the most striking examples appears in the birth of modern psychology. Figures like Carl Jung openly acknowledge their debt to alchemy, Gnosticism, and Hermetic symbolism, arguing that ancient esoteric systems were not primitive errors, but symbolic maps of the human psyche. Jung believed that myths, symbols, and alchemical imagery represented universal patterns of the unconscious, guiding individuals towards psychological integration and self-realization. What medieval alchemists described as the transmutation of lead into gold, Jung reframed as the transformation of fragmented consciousness into a unified self. Though stripped of mystical language, the underlying esoteric principle remained intact. True knowledge involves inner change. At the same time, Western esotericism quietly shaped modern art, literature, and music. Symbolist painters, surrealist artists, and visionary writers drew heavily on occult imagery, mythic archetypes, and altered states of consciousness to challenge materialist views of reality. Their work reflected the esoteric conviction that reality is layered and that imagination is not mere fantasy, but a gateway to deeper truths. Political movements, too, were not immune. Revolutionary ideologies often borrowed esoteric language of awakening, illumination, and rebirth, framing social change as a process of collective transformation. Even national myths and founding symbols in the modern West reveal traces of esoteric thought, using geometry, light imagery, and allegory to express ideals of progress, freedom, and moral order.
Yet perhaps the most visible modern manifestation of Western esotericism lies in contemporary spirituality. Practices such as meditation, visualization, manifestation, and the pursuit of inner awakening have become mainstream, often presented as secular self-improvement or wellness techniques. While many practitioners are unaware of their origins, these methods echo ancient esoteric teachings about consciousness shaping reality and the individual's capacity for transformation. At the same time, this mainstreaming has diluted depth. Concepts once embedded within ethical discipline and philosophical rigor are now frequently reduced to slogans or consumer products, severed from their historical context. This tension mirrors the ancient conflict between inner knowledge and external authority, now recast as a struggle between depth and convenience. Critics argue that modern esoteric revival encourages escapism or magical thinking, while defenders counter that it addresses a genuine hunger left unmet by purely material explanations of existence. Both perspectives reveal something essential. Western esotericism has always thrived during periods of cultural uncertainty, moments when dominant narratives fail to answer fundamental human questions. In an age defined by data, speed, and fragmentation, esoteric ideas offer a countercurrent, emphasizing meaning, integration, and participation in a larger order. This influence is rarely acknowledged because it operates below the surface, shaping language, metaphors, and assumptions rather than institutions. The modern world, for all its apparent rationality, continues to be guided by symbols, myths, and inner narratives, precisely the terrain esotericism has explored for millennia. The climax of this hidden history, then, is not a revelation of secret masters or concealed rituals, but the recognition that Western esotericism never disappeared. It transformed. It adapted to modern forms of knowledge, quietly informing how people understand the self, creativity, healing, and purpose. What was once guarded in temples and lodges now appears in therapy rooms, art galleries, spiritual workshops, and digital communities, often unrecognized but deeply influential. And in this realization lies the most surprising insight of all, that the modern West, despite its claims of disenchantment, remains profoundly shaped by the very traditions it once sought to suppress. The esoteric did not fail. It succeeded so completely that it became invisible, woven seamlessly into the fabric of modern life.
As we arrive at the end of this hidden journey, the secret history of Western esotericism reveals itself not as a fringe curiosity or a discarded relic of the past, but as a continuous undercurrent shaping how the West has searched for meaning across centuries of change, conflict, and transformation. From the mystery traditions of the ancient world to medieval alchemists, from Renaissance philosophers to modern psychologists and artists, esotericism persisted because it addressed something timeless, the human need to understand not only how the world works, but why existence feels layered, symbolic, and unfinished. It challenged the assumption that knowledge is merely external, proposing instead that understanding requires inner participation, moral responsibility, and transformation of perception. This idea repeatedly brought esoteric traditions into conflict with institutions built on authority, uniform belief, and control. Yet it also ensured their survival by forcing them to evolve, adapt, and speak in new languages. What history often framed as suppression or disappearance was, in truth, a strategic retreat into symbols, stories, and practices capable of outlasting political regimes and intellectual fashions. In the modern world, where information is abundant but meaning often feels scarce, the quiet return of esoteric ideas suggests that the questions they addressed were never fully resolved. Practices now labeled as mindfulness, depth psychology,
creative visualization, or personal awakening echo ancient insights once guarded in temples and lodges. The danger, as history shows, lies not in seeking hidden knowledge, but in stripping it of context, discipline, and ethical grounding. Western esotericism, at its best, never promised easy power or instant enlightenment. It demanded patience, humility, and responsibility, insisting that inner change precede outer influence. Understanding this tradition in its full historical depth allows us to move beyond fear, sensationalism, and conspiracy, and instead see it as a mirror reflecting humanity's long struggle to reconcile reason with mystery, structure with freedom, and knowledge with wisdom. The real secret of Western esotericism is not that it controlled history from the shadows, but that it survived by asking deeper questions than any single era was ready to answer openly. And perhaps that is why it continues to resurface whenever societies reach moments of uncertainty, reminding us that beneath the surface of progress and certainty, the search for meaning never truly ends. If this hidden history changed how you see the past, or even how you see yourself, share your thoughts in the comments and let the conversation continue. And if you want to explore another forgotten current that shaped the modern world, watch the next video and keep listening to the whispers history still carries forward.